Time-lapse and hyperlapse are fascinating techniques between photography and videography. They work particularly well with drones, and I have done countless of videos about them. In this video I will show how to make a time-lapse with a drone from start to finish, in the easiest possible way, so that the beginner can easily start creating them. I will very soon do another similar video about hyperlapses. I will be using the excellent DJI Mini 3 Pro, this guy, but the same settings apply to all other models of the current DJI prosumer line. The two techniques are practically identical, the only difference is that in the case of time-lapse, the point of view, which is the camera of the drone, is static. In other words, the drone is hovering in the same position, while in an hyperlapse the aircraft is in motion. In both cases, the scene must contain a good amount of movement, coming from cars, people walking, boats, or other vehicle. In either case, the movement might be due to natural events, like clouds or transition from day to night. This is the scene I have chosen, a small village in the foothill of Mount Etna, with a volcano behind. For the first time-lapse I focus on the center of the small village to keep things as easy as possible. The camera will point down, keeping the sky out of the frame, so that the difference in luminosity will be very low, making it much easier to find the correct exposure. Then we need to choose the best time of the day. It is a very quiet village and we need some action, so I will focus on the busiest part of the day, which should be around 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning or 6 to 7 in the evening. These are also good times for light conditions. I absolutely avoid shooting in the middle of a sunny day, as the shadows are way too harsh and the results are always disappointing. Much better to choose the first couple of hours after sunrise or the last 2 before sunset for much softer shadows. Another perfect time for time-lapse is right after sunset, when the street light turns on and there is still a bit of twilight. Another thing to consider is the position of the sun in the scene. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the sun will be behind the camera, which makes things easier. For beginners, it is better to avoid shooting time-lapses with drones in the direction of the sun, as it is a very advanced technique and requires some serious post-processing. First thing to select is the length of the time-lapse, which depends on the battery life. The regular battery of the Mini 3 Pro has a life of a bit more than 30 minutes. Considering the time needed for the setup and for a safe return home, it is better to plan a maximum shooting time of about 22 minutes. I like to plan most drone time-lapses and hyperlapses at a length of 13 seconds. This requires a bit more than 300 photos when using a 24 frame per second timeline, as 13 multiplied by 24 frames equals 312 shots. The second parameter to select is the interval between each photo. With drones, in most cases we choose either 3 or 4 seconds. I have covered in full all the settings needed for time-lapses and hyperlapses in this video. Please refer to it for more details by clicking on the link on the screen. With an interval of 3, the shooting time for the time-lapse will be about 16 minutes, which is perfectly safe. With an interval of 4 seconds, it will take about 22 minutes, which is still fine, but there will be no time to waste for a safe return to home. So, let's go for a length of 13 seconds and an interval of 3 seconds. I put the Mini 3 Pro up in the air at 8 o'clock in the morning, hoping to catch some movement of cars and people going to work. After framing the scene, it is time to set the exposure. For time-lapses and hyperlapses, it is crucial to always use manual exposure, as we want total control of the shutter speed value. In the case of drones, the ideal shutter speed value is 1 second in condition of light wind, in order to get the correct amount of motion blur. 1 second is also the time it takes to hit the light button, which would be highly appreciated if you enjoy the video. Motion blur is the single most important factor to consider when shooting time-lapses. Please refer to my specific video about motion blur by clicking on the link on the screen. The Mini 3 Pro, like the Air 2S, has a fixed aperture, so the only parameter besides shutter speed to set for exposure is the ISO. The only model of DJI prosumer line with a variable aperture is the Mavic 3. Regarding ISO, ideally we want to set it to the minimum value, which is 100. But if needed, we can go up to 400 without a major loss in image quality. To be able to set this precise value in different light conditions, ND filters are absolutely needed when shooting time lapses. You will find links to the one I suggest in the description. More detail on why ND filters are needed are in my video linked on the screen. When shooting time lapses with the Mini 3 during the day, strong values of ND filter are needed, due to the very wide aperture of this drone at f1.7. Capable of gathering plenty of light. When shooting after sunrise or before sunset or with the sun covered by clouds, the filter value needed will be ND64, 128 or 256. A bit of trial and error is involved. I'm ready for action as planned at 8 o'clock in the morning, a bit more than an hour after sunrise. The sun is shining and I immediately notice that the light is already too strong, especially for this scene. The village has very narrow streets and in this case a strong light produces very harsh shadows, something I really dislike. I have the feeling that it would be much better to start an hour earlier or to try with the sun covered by clouds. I put on my strongest ND filter, a mighty ND1000, and start to expose. The exposure settings are relative to each single photo or video mode, so always remember to enter Hyperlapse mode before exposing. I choose Hyperlapse and the first mode to the top, free, the one suitable for static time lapses. I keep the ISO to the lowest value, 100, and then I go to set the very important shutter speed value. To expose, I always check carefully the histogram. In order to avoid burning the highlights, I like to leave a little room between the last bar on the right and the right edge. I also check the value at the bottom. I prefer it to be at around minus 0.7. But in this case, I cannot dial in my ideal shutter speed of 1 second, which produces a nice motion blur. I have to settle for a faster shutter speed of a quarter of a second. The scene will be ever so slight overexposed and I will lose a bit of motion blur, but it is the best compromise under these conditions. It would have been better to use a stronger ND filter, an ND2000, but I don't have one available. Even better is to start an hour earlier, right after sunrise, for a much softer light. I then set the other parameters. For this scene where the main movement will come from cars, I can set the interval to 3 seconds. At this interval, a time-lapse of 13 seconds will take about 16 minutes, which leaves me a good amount of battery life. I will not have to stress out for a safe return home. Then I set the length at the desired value of 13 seconds. The last value is maximum speed, but since the drone will hover in a static position, I don't have to worry about it. By tapping on the small icon on the bottom left of the exposure window, I enter other values. I generally set the white balance at about 5500 kelvins, but the Mini 3 has a tendency toward a warmish tone, so I prefer a lower value at around 5000. Then there is a choice for the resolution of the auto-generate time-lapse between 1080p and 4K. I always choose 4K and I suggest doing so. But in this first example, I tried 1080p, just to see the result. The next selection is to save each individual photo as JPEG or RAW. I always save them in RAW format, so that I can process them using the excellent Luminar Neo, and finally import them as JPEG into my video editor. This workflow is much more powerful and yields far better results, but I will analyze it in an upcoming video. The auto-generated short movies have improved a lot in recent DJI models and can certainly be used by beginners to quickly post their masterpieces on social media. This is the result of the auto-generated short movie. Some degree of stabilization has already been applied, but some drifting remains. Things get better after stabilizing on Premiere Pro. I am not particularly happy with the result. The shadows are too harsh due to the strong light. The motion blur is not the best, as I could not use the ideal shutter speed. And also I was hoping for a bit more car and people action. But this is normal with time-lapses. After choosing the scene, the first take is useful mostly for exploring. It helps to choose the ideal condition to get the best results. I'm sure that an hour earlier will work better, and probably even better right after sunset. Since I'm here, I decide to turn the camera toward Mount Etna for a different scene. This time the movement came mostly from the clouds. There is hardly any wind, and the clouds look perfectly still. So I increased the interval between photos to 4 seconds in order to speed up the movement. The downside is that the time-lapse will be slightly shorter. With a longer interval, the movement in the cloud is quite interesting. At sunset, I go back to the previous location. I put on an ND filter, and this time I managed to dial in a shutter speed very close to 1 second. The rest of the settings are the same as the one of the first time-lapse. As you can see, the flow of the car is much smoother, with a correct amount of motion blur. The shadows are also much softer. I was hoping in more electric lights to turn on for a more interesting effect, but here at the moment they're trying to save as much as possible on the bills. In a transition from day to night, much better results are obtained by post-processing the individual raw files for more control of the white balance and of the shifting luminosity. But I decided to stick to the auto-generated time-lapses here. I will cover the post-processing in an upcoming video. I have put together a playlist with several videos that analyze all the topics needed for drone time-lapses and hyperlapses. You can access it by clicking on this link. Don't forget to hit the like button if you find this video interesting. Thank you.